This interview is a part of the Oklahoma Historical Society's Oral History Program Living Legends collection. This interview was originally conducted in May of 1970. We have no specific date. The interview is conducted by Mr. Pendleton Woods. The interviewee is Mr. Herbert L. Brannon, that's Branan, of Edmond, Oklahoma. This interview is being re-recorded on September the 13th, 1985, for inclusion in the permanent collections of the Oral History Program by Judith Michener.
Been prominent in many fields in Oakland, well as business fields. Mr. Brannon, I wonder if you would tell me just a little about your personal background, your family background, where you were born, and where you were educated.
I was born March 22nd, 1907, Webbers Falls, Oklahoma, then Indian Territory. My mother was named Emma Hanks. My father was William I. Brannon. He came from Georgia as a young man to Indian Territory and stayed here. I had 5 brothers and 3 sisters in my family. I went to the common public schools of Webbers Falls, which were then known as Brewers Academy, having been originated uh, under Indian Territory days. My father was on the Board of Education at that time that built the school. I went to Muskogee in 1916, attended public schools there, Muskogee Central High School, later to Northeastern State College at Tahlequah, Junior College at Muskogee, Oklahoma University, graduated in 1932, and in 1938 graduated with a law degree from the University of Oklahoma Law School. In 1934 I decided to run for the Oklahoma legislature and did that and was elected my first term beginning in January of 1935. I served 3 terms in the House of Representatives from Muskogee County in office number 1. In 1940 I was defeated for the legislature on my 4th try and became the legal advisor to Governor Leon C. Phillips in the fall of 1940 and helped him write legislation, was a liaison man and legal advisor to him during his term as governor, the last 2 years of his term.
Let's go back now to let's go to Webbers Falls. Um, could you tell us a little bit about Webbers Falls when you were growing up, about the town itself?
When I was growing up, Webbers Falls was at the end of a rail line which ran from Webbers Falls to Warner, 12 miles. And at Warner, it became connected with the Millen Valley Railway. The railway ran to Webbers Falls because commerce could then cross the Arkansas River to then Gore, Oklahoma, which was called Camel-IT back in early days. And there, the Missouri Pacific ran from Kansas City to east, to Kansas City on the north, and through Fort Gibson, Gore, and east to Memphis. So commerce would use the 12-mile railway, the ferry across the river to get on the main line of the Missouri Pacific. In Webbers Falls, that was a cotton, corn, potato growing area. The first Irish potatoes commercially grown in Oklahoma were grown by my father, who ran farms south of Webbers Falls. We always lived in town, but he had his farms south of Webbers Falls along the river, raised alfalfa and potatoes generally. Never did raise cotton. There were lots of cotton farmers, but it was a different type of farming which he never did like. Webbers Falls then was a thriving community, had 2 banks when I was a young child, and was a real commercial center. What made it so was that there was a falls at Weber's Falls just north of town on the Arkansas River that had a fall of about 15 feet. This is along in 1911, 12 that I can remember. Now, today in 1970, those falls are imperceptible because they've been silted up. But there was an actual fall there. As a result of the fall, all boating up and down the river had to portage around the falls in low water. Washington Irving stated in his Tour of the Prairies that he had to portage around those falls in 1820 or 29 when he came up the Arkansas River to go to Fort Gibson. This made Weber's Falls one of the centers of trade in the early Cherokee Nation going back to 1830 when it was originally established.
Could you tell a little about the University of Oklahoma at the time you were there?
I went to the University of Oklahoma in 1930. This was the depth of the Depression. Graduated in 1932. There was a preponderance of men, probably 2 men for each female student at the university. The student enrollments were between 4,000 and 5,000, and all the students that could worked if they could find a job at 25 cents an hour. That was the going rate. You could work 3 hours a day and get 3 meals, or work 3 hours a day and eat 2 meals and get a place to sleep. And in this way, you would be able to stay in school if you'd rake up $5 or $10 a month for spending money and for other little things. I was in school there 2 years on a baccalaureate degree and never went to a single football game that I can remember because students like me didn't go to games because they didn't have the money to do it. I lived in the McFarland Church. 16 boys had rooms in the church. They'd turned part of the church into a dormitory because the Depression was on and the church was not used. So they brought their own beds, their own bed goods, mattresses, other furniture, would buy it when students would leave, buy it from leaving students. And there were 16 boys that lived there. Myself and one other fellow had 2 Sunday school classrooms which we had partitioned off, and we used that. There were 12 boys in the dormitory of the McFarland Church, which was closed up and not used for any other purpose other than the students going to school. And then there were 2 or 3 others that stayed at different parts. The church had a printing press, and one boy ran that for his sleeping quarters. And that's about the way a lot of them went to school in those days at OU. The teaching we thought was fine. We went to school to get educated. We went down there to learn. And we didn't go through a lot of extracurricular activities. The only time we'd go home would be to catch a ride with someone from Norman to Muskogee and go home to do a little work to get enough money to stay another month. And this is the actual truth. I kept a set of books for a real estate firm in Muskogee, and we'd go home about every 2 or 3 weeks and work on a weekend to make $5 or $10 to stay in school another month. And this was got to be a normal thing. The only way we could do would be to hitch a ride with somebody who was going, since the only way to get there by train was to go on the Katy. It took all day up and all day back, 2 days out of time to go and come, or to go by bus, which was quite a long, arduous route.
What personalities, faculty personalities, were memorable to you, and would you describe them?
Well, in my undergraduate, I was a major in philosophy. Dr. Charles M. Perry was one of the outstanding teachers of the time. He wrote a lot of books in philosophy, and he was my major advisor, and I learned a lot from him. Dean Gittinger was another great character on the campus. He was the Dean of Administration, and any problem that I had about going to school or what I had to do, he was always available to help out and figure out a way to get done what I wanted to do and still stay within the rules. I had some mathematics teachers who were very helpful to me. One was Mr. Edmondson. I can't remember his first name. He was a graduate assistant. When I went to the university, I was deficient in algebra and geometry and had to take what's called a slow course. I would get 3 hours credit for a 5-hour course. But this graduate assistant, who was married and working his way through school teaching, would tell me to come over to his home in the evening and we would go through algebra and math. The result is I came out of the university with the highest grade I could get in math in a slow course. You couldn't make A in a slow course, you could only get a B. But I came out a Phi Beta Kappa overall, which indicated to me that if I really wanted to learn and I would do it, I could learn most anything I set out to do. My math class, I scheduled it so that it would come at 11 o'clock in the morning, and then I could go home at noon and I would get my algebra before I did anything else in the afternoon, and that way I became proficient in mathematics because I was too deficient to let it go by and not do something about it. I thought a lot of Dr. Bazell. He was a president of the university. He was one of the great educators of the time. He had a clear knowledge of what education was about and a very true philosophy of education that he worked at both on the campus and off the campus. It wasn't something that he preached in one place and practiced something else somewhere else. He was one of the great presidents of the university.
Your first term in the legislature was what year?
I was elected to the legislature in 1934 and went to the legislature January 1935. That was my first session. I had been to the legislature as an observer on some matter of legislation during the 1933 session. And while observing from the gallery, I decided that I would go home and run for the office. There were 3 representatives from Muskogee County at the time, and they numbered their positions 1, 2, and 3, and I picked number 1 and announced my candidacy and started campaigning in spring of 1934. I was elected in the summer of 1934, and the session began in 1935. Governor Marlin was beginning his first session of the legislature. He was elected governor in 1934 and began his term in January of 1935. Leon C. Phillips, who had been in the legislature several sessions before 1935, was an active candidate for speaker, and he was elected speaker in the 1935 session. And not long after the session had been underway, he broke with Marlin. He never was with him, but they became definitely on different sides of nearly every issue. And the House of Representatives, and the majority of it, stood with Phillips. And Phillips actually dominated state government at the time by controlling, through his own personality, without patronage and without any administrative assistance. He guided the whole state and the legislative policy for that term of the legislature. The Senate tended to side with Governor Marlin, and the House of Representatives was the balance wheel against many of the policies that Marlin wanted, which were higher taxes, more relief, more expenditure, and more New Deal policies that he was coming with from Washington. Marlin had been congressman from the northern part of Oklahoma, and he came back to Oklahoma to bring the New Deal, he said. Oklahoma was not ready to accept the New Deal, and Marlin's major proposals were never enacted into law, and largely because of the Phillips position and the men who stood with him during the first session of Marlin's term.
Would you describe Governor Marlin as a personality as you know him?
Governor Marlin had come to Oklahoma from Pennsylvania. As I said, Governor Marlin had come to Oklahoma from Pennsylvania and had gone into the oil business. He probably was in the oil business in Pennsylvania, but he came to Oklahoma in the teens, around the period of the First World War, and started the Marlin Oil Company at Ponca City. He was one of the first big developers in the Osage Nation, which had one time the largest production of oil in any area then producing in the world. And along with a number of other people, they produced oil out of the Osage Nation, got state-owned leases mostly from state-owned lands, and built great oil companies. Lew Wentz was one of these people. The Phillips Petroleum started in the same way. Marlin was at Ponca City, which was also the home of Lew Wentz, who was a Republican, Marlin the Democrat. During the 20s, Marlin was one of the largest business operators in Oklahoma, but he overexpanded, and in the Depression of 28 and 29, he lost control of his company to bondholders and people who had loaned him money, loaned the company money, and he lost control and was out of the Marlin Oil Company. They changed the name to Continental Oil Company, and it is today the Continental Oil Company, the survivor of the old Marlin Company. After he was out of the oil business, it was always said that he was broke, but he was still a very wealthy man in terms of what the average person thought about. For instance, he had a home in Ponca City, which was a huge mansion, an estate, that he said he had to close because he couldn't afford to live in it, but his servants' quarters, where he did live at the time I first met him, was as large as some of the mansions here in Oklahoma City are. So if he was a poor man and had to move out of his home into his servants' quarters, it was still a nice-sized mansion. And that's where I first saw him. And after the legislature was elected in 1934, Marlin knew that the great mass of the greater number of the members of the House elected were not favorable to him. And he called a meeting of all the House of Representative members, even before they were sworn in, to come to Ponca City in November of 34 and meet him and let him explain his ideas. This was done. I remember going from Muskogee to Ponca City with 2 or 3 other people in a car. Took all day up there, nearly had a meeting in his sumptuous servants' quarters, and Marlin came down to meet this group of legislators, walking between 2 large Russian wolfhounds like a country English squire, which was the worst impression he could give to a group of legislators who were elected in the depth of the Depression when there were thousands of people out of work. But to come into the meeting in this sort of fashion started him off in the worst way. He was a very genteel man, a gentleman, but his ideas were visionary. He was wanting to do lots of things, but it took lots of taxes to do it. The people were against any new taxes. Thousands of homes during that time and farms were being sold for taxes, and yet Marlin wanted to add on more and more. There were 70,000 people who applied for jobs at the Capitol during Marlin's first year as governor, and this created a tremendous problem for him and for the members of the legislature, because they would come to the legislators and try to get help on getting state jobs, and the jobs were not available, but the governor had encouraged them to apply so he could build up pressure to get some of the things he wanted. He failed in this. Marlin never understood state government. He had been a very prominent businessman, head of a large corporation with a large executive staff, which is an entirely different type of operation from running the state government, where he would, as governor, deal with other people who had as much power maybe as he did. And he never realized the sovereign nature of the three departments of government. He never understood it. And he would get very much upset because what he wanted to do would not be done. As head of a large corporation, he might have issued an order and gotten it carried out without dissent, but in dealing with the legislators, these people did not do things without dissenting, and they had their own ideas which they were not afraid to express, often did express, and this was a very distasteful thing to a man like Marlin, who was trained as the head of a large business corporation. Being governor means that you must listen to people and accept some of their ideas, because they have as much responsibility to people who elect them as he has to people who voted for him. But Marlin never would concede this. I mean, it was not a thing that he would let enter his mind. I remember one time I went down to ask him to be against a certain bill to repeal prohibition. I was against repeal of prohibition. This had to be done by an amendment to the Constitution, and I asked him if he would oppose it, and he said to me, "I'm sure I will tell you I will never sign it if it comes to my desk." Truth of the matter is, under the law of Oklahoma, he never had the power nor the authority or the opportunity to veto a constitutional proposal going to the people for a vote. His legal advisors hadn't told him this, and he didn't know enough about state government to realize that there was nothing he could do about it anyway. But yet he was making a promise to me on what he would do on something that he had no power to do. To me, this was a lack of information in a man who is governor. As I say, he never really understood state government. Having come out of Congress, he was one of the few people who did come out of Congress to run for governor, and the type of office is so different. The function is so completely opposite, being in the Congress of the Senate of the United States and being in the governor's chair, that a man has to understand it, or else he does a lot of things wrong. The office of governor is a source of executive power. It is a position of power. Member of the legislature, both the state and the Senate and the legislature of Oklahoma, and in the National Congress, the Senate and the representative congressmen, they are men who create laws, and they're not sources of executive power. They are representative of people who individually are sovereign, and people actually think of a senator or as a congressman as being their man. This, in practical effect, works out this way. People like to be on the side of power. This is true in government and in business. And they like to get on the governor's side if they can. And this is the difference. A member of the Senate or House, people expect the senator or the legislator to be on their side. They're not trying to get on his side. They expect him to be their agent. And the principle of agency and principle actually is in their thoughts. this is such a fundamental difference unless a person realizes it. As a governor or a senator, he makes many mistakes and is frustrated, can't do the job, and is what Marlin was in many ways unsuccessful in achieving anything on the scale that he started out to do it. He did achieve some things and put them into effect. For the first time in Oklahoma, the school system was really surveyed and analyzed by the Brookings Institution, which Marlin brought to Oklahoma to do that. He also created the Oklahoma Planning and Resources Board, but was greatly diminished in power from what he wanted. And other than these two things, he accomplished very little. He did lay the framework for these. The state of Oklahoma never had given direct state aid, primary aid to the common schools prior to Marlin. They had given weak aid, supplemental help to school districts and counties, but never straight out of the state treasury for primary aid. This was one thing that began in Marlin's time and has grown ever since. I would say that his two great accomplishments were the reorientation of the common school system and the Oklahoma Planning and Resources Board, which has changed in many ways since he originated it, but this was one of his pets.
What were the key items that came before the legislature during your first term?
The key items coming before the legislature were Homestead Exemption and adding the sales tax, which up to Governor Murray's time was not a part of the financial structure of Oklahoma, and financing public schools and financing old age pensions. The old age pension program had been adopted by the people and had to be financed during the Marlin administration. The ad valorem tax under Governor Murray had been completely reoriented to eliminate any part of the state ad valorem tax going for state government. All the ad valorem taxes after Governor Murray were designated and could be only for local government, city, county, and school districts. The state treasury got no part of the ad valorem tax. The ad valorem tax was levied on property by value, and everybody pushed and got enacted a sales tax, which was on the flow of goods and commerce, purchases and sales, which was a fast producer of revenue and went up and down with prices and with the economy. Marlin pushed for a sales tax. Murray had talked about a sales tax, but this was enacted. At that time, the general revenue of the state amounted to about $20 million. Schools were getting the smallest part of that, 2 or 3 million. Marlin's first session, schools were allocated $10 million or a little more for common schools, and the rest was split among departments and institutions. Higher education was not a problem at that time. So, you want to cut that off. So the real problems were financing old age pensions, common schools, and the ordinary departments of government. The Homestead Exemption had been voted by the people, whereby homesteads would be relieved of ad valorem taxation. It was up to the legislature to vitalize this constitutional provision, which the legislature did, and exempted from taxes the first $1,000 of value. At that time, values were very low on all real property and personal property, and $1,000 was quite a large exemption when it came to ad valorem taxes. Today, $1,000 off amounts to very little in actual value and in dollars and cents.
You first came in into the legislature under Governor Murray, I believe. Was it, Marlon? Um, did you ever have any connection of or association with Governor Murray?
Yes, I knew Governor Murray. I talked with him every now and then when he was around the Capitol. In my life, I've known every governor except Governor Cruz and Governor Robertson. I say I've known them. I have known who they were. They may not have known me. I knew Governor Haskell as a high school student in Muskogee. Governor Haskell was the first governor. In 1928, he lived in Muskogee, and I would visit with him occasionally as a high school senior and go down to talk to him about things. I knew Governor Walden when he was was a state officer after he was governor. I knew Governor Williams when he was a federal judge and came to Muskogee to hold court, and I was a high school student and would see him often and around the building where I worked, which was near the federal courthouse in Muskogee, and very often would eat with him because he was a very individual, solitary person, and liked to talk to people at meals, whether he knew them or not. I was one of those who would sit and listen. Governor Murray I knew after I came to the legislature because he visited the Capitol frequently, and very often if I had a real tough question and I saw Murray and asked him about it as a constitutional lawyer, what he thought, he would not only give his opinion, he gave it freely and voluminously and loud, so that there was no mistake about what he thought about it. But this was a very great help in many cases. I was once directed to write a bill, or asked by the Governor Phillips to write a bill on appropriations, and I heard Governor Murray down the hall talking to somebody about this very question. So I went out and stood in the hall and listened to his dissertation on why the Constitution is worded like it was. And it solved the problem on how I was to draft this legislation. Actually, Governor Murray never knew that he had talked to me. I merely stood down the hall and listened to his explanation to some woman in the Secretary of State's office when he would explain why the Constitution was written like it was. He did this very often. He would meet people and explain why something was that way, why he'd written it that way, he said. So I knew Murray in that way, and I would, if I ran into him and had a thought on my mind about the Constitution, I would maybe ask him about it, and he'd give the answers. He had them. And they were all pretty sound. He had a good sound philosophy, and he could go into great detail on why things were like they were. After I knew Governor Holloway very well during the time I was in the legislature, and afterwards, even till his death in 1970. I was very close to Governor Holloway. We had lunch together at least once and many times twice a week up to the time he passed away, because he was active and interested in government, and so was I. And after I worked for Governor Phillips, I knew Robert S. Kerr, who was governor. I knew Roy Turner, and have had a number of dealings with him in government. Raymond Gary after. Johnson Murray I know today as a lawyer. Johnson Murray I know today as a lawyer here in Oklahoma City. Governor Edmondson I knew in Muskogee and his family before him. George Nye, who served 9 days as governor, is still a very close friend of mine. Mr. Bellman, who was governor, came into office and I helped him get elected when he ran. Likewise, I'm very well acquainted with Governor Bartlett today. Governor Gary was a very fine governor. I thought a lot of him and still do, because men like Gary and Phillips along the line have touched some high spots in Oklahoma's history and made some very deep impressions because they understood the office of governor and exercised the power of that office. There were some men who I thought didn't understand the governor's office and were afraid of the job. Basically, they didn't admit that, or no one else would say that. But Governor Marlin never understood what the office was about. Governor Johnson Murray never paid much attention to the problems that existed. Governor Kerr was governor during the war and didn't have any problems, either financially or government. And Governor Edmondson was not fully aware of the type of office he was filling. I think that Governor Bartlett is a man of high caliber, culture, educated, and has a complete understanding of what the office entails, both from maintaining the dignity and the action back of what he must do. He's the present governor, and of course I was appointed by him as chairman of the Consumer Affairs Commission a year ago, and still in that position. I see him frequently, and he calls me occasionally to discuss certain matters, and this is a nice relationship which I enjoy, but I've had this relationship with a number of governors in the past, and I've got close-up range on quite a number of them. I think every period of time and its problems, there has been a governor there, and the governor has either coped with those problems intelligently or he has not. And during the time when Governor Murray was in office, he was a blustery man who took strong positions and got action. That's what the times needed. When Governor Kerr was in office, there was not much to do. The office was very quiet in the way of running the state because the soldiers were away at the war and the financial problems didn't exist. Nobody wanted jobs, nobody wanted appropriations, and the governor really had a easy job, comparatively speaking. When Phillips was in, it took a man of decisive action, knowing what he could do and wanted to do. The times required that, and he filled it very well. And he wouldn't fit today because the climate for a public office has entirely changed. The real measure of a governor is how well he governs, because that's what he is supposed to do. Some governors have stepped forward to meet problems. Some governors have backed away and ran from them. Some governors have let them overcome them and not even have been aware they had problems. And this is the measure of how well a man is governor. Governor Bellman and Governor Gary and Governor Bartlett all were men who liked to step forth and meet a situation before it became a problem and govern it. That's what a governor does. If it becomes a problem before he can even understand what it is, then he fails to even grasp the job. This is one thing that, for instance, in Governor Bartlett's situation, he's the second governor to serve with a Democratic lieutenant governor. And from reading newspapers, one would get the impression that these two men are at loggerheads and mad at each other and fighting all the time. This is not the case. Governor Bartlett knows and understands that there must be a governor on hand at all times. When the governor leaves the state, the lieutenant governor should know that he is then the governor. When the lieutenant governor leaves, the president of the Senate should know that he is then the governor. And when he leaves, the Speaker of the House of Representatives assumes the duties of the office. With the way the situation is now, with turbulent riots in higher education and racial matters, it is too much of a risk for any of these officials not to work with the others so that any of them can be apprised when the others are away. Whoever is to be governor should know it. And there is an understanding among these men that they will act this way. This is a very great thing that the public's hardly aware of. But when Governor Bartlett leaves the state, he lets Lieutenant Governor Nye know that he is gone and that Nye is then the governor, because there may be a riot at the penitentiary that demands action, or a riot at the University of Oklahoma break out on 10 minutes notice as it did yesterday, demanding action. And these men have this understanding, and they meet and discuss these matters. And to read from the newspapers, you would think there is no cooperation at all. Yet deep down, both of them have a full understanding of their own power, their own authority, and their own duties. And they're very thoughtful, very diligent, and very careful to perform these duties. And they are on those planes. They work together in good fashion. Governor Bartlett is also a man who likes to recognize problems as they begin to arise in order that they do not become overwhelming. And he thinks through his positions. He does this without being pushed. He's not the crisis type of governor. We've had governors who were always issuing statements on crises that something had to do, or else the whole state would be in trouble. Bartlett is not this type of individual. He usually has a very calm attitude, both among his advisors and among his personnel and in his public relations. This doesn't mean he doesn't worry and think about these things, because I think it's the thinking about them and the worrying about them that gives him the inward stability to be calm and take deliberate action after really analyzing the thing in hand and bringing it around to a point where he can really govern the situation. And I say that the governor ought to be measured by how well he governs as he goes along.
One that you mentioned but didn't say anything about him as a personality from your observation is Governor Haskell. Could you discuss him from your observation?
I never knew Governor Haskell as an official. Governor Haskell had been governor of Oklahoma. He was the first governor. He had come to Oklahoma from Ohio as a railroad builder, and he settled in Muskogee, and he built railroads as an engineer, and was elected governor in and served the first term in 1907. He was a very astute businessman in Muskogee. All I know is what my friends there in Muskogee told me about Haskell, who they knew him firsthand. I only knew him as a student. After being out of the office of governor 10 or 15 years, he got into the oil business. Went to New York and organized an oil company. And this oil company had some real problems, the result of which Governor Haskell and some of his associates went to Mexico and stayed because the situation demanded that they leave the country. I can't go into details on why this was true, but this is what happened. Later on, this matter was cleared up, or they were tried or something, or the charges were dismissed. I don't know what they were. He came back to Oklahoma and became active in promoting the presidential race for Alfred E. Smith for the presidency of the United States. And in order to have a base to operate from, he had to come back to Muskogee to be elected a delegate to the State Democratic Convention, and from that be elected a delegate to the National Convention in Houston, where Governor Smith of New York was nominated as a candidate for Democratic presidential candidate. Haskell did achieve these things, and it was during this period of 1927-28, when I was a high school senior, that I became interested in politics and was elected president of the Muskogee County League of Young Democrats in 1927. And I got to see Haskell. Sometimes I would go down to his office in the Turner Hotel where he lived, and he spent all of his time there. He had a great number of friends, and they would come by to visit with him and talk with him, and he would sit at a table, played solitaire most of the time by himself, and talk to people who came to visit with him, talking about the political situation. And this is where I first knew him. Actually, at the time, I was interested in how I was going to college, and I would go talk to people like Haskell as get their advice on how to go to college or what I should do, or maybe to get a job somewhere at a college or university where I could work my way through. This is one of the things I talked to him about. Of course, he was very kind and friendly and gave me lots of advice, none of which ever panned out to mean anything. But I did get acquainted with him. As I say, he would sit at a table in his hotel room and play solitaire and talk. And then somebody else came to visit him, why he just continued to play and kept right on talking. And he had lots of visitors. He organized a carrot company in Muskogee. He thought sugar could be made out of carrots, so he organized the Muskogee Carrot Sugar Corporation. Took up a lot of solicited from people to buy stock, and they did, and financed it. Never did pan out. Nothing ever happened. I think the building is still there with the old sign on it today, Carrot Sugar Corporation. I've seen it in recent years. But during his term as governor, I have no first-hand knowledge. He went from Muskogee to the Houston Convention in 1928, I believe, when Al Smith was nominated. It was his one-half a vote, I understand, in the Oklahoma delegation that swung the tide, making Oklahoma vote as a unit for Smith. And as long about in the roll call of Oklahoma, that the unit rule applied, and Oklahoma threw its 20 votes to Smith, which put him into the actual running against the other candidate, Mr. McAdoo, who was trying to be the presidential nominee on the Democratic ticket. After this, Haskell was not very active in politics in Oklahoma. I don't know why. As far as I was concerned, I never did see him much after 1928 or 9. I can't explain this when I go to thinking of it now, but he just wasn't in the orbit where I was operating, I guess.
Your closest relationship, I suppose, was Governor Phillips as a legal advisor on his staff. I wonder if you could discuss him as a personality and as a governor from the standpoint of the things that happened during his administration.
Yes, 1935, I was one of the signers on Phillips' caucus call to make him Speaker of the House. He was elected. In 1937, he wanted to be Speaker again, but the Marlin group defeated him, and I was still one of his signers. And during the 37th session of the legislature, I was among the 39 or 40 members who stayed as a block called the Phillips Block in the whole session, and by having about that many votes out of 120 members, we were pretty well able to control the direction of legislation, although we weren't a majority. And when Phillips ran for governor, I was for him. I helped Brannon run his campaign in Muskogee County in 1938. And I was elected to the legislature in 1938 again and stayed. And then in 1939, I was chairman of the Revenue Committee for the House, in which committee all revenue bills had to originate. that year we rewrote most of the tax laws, putting the money into the General Revenue Fund because this was one of the issues that we had run on, that we would do away with earmarking if possible. So during this period, I was very close to Governor Phillips as chairman of the House Committee on Revenue, and we discussed many things and worked out many bills together. And in 1940, when I ran for the legislature the fourth time, I was defeated. And the day after the election, I came over to Oklahoma City to see the governor, and he said, well, if your people in Muskogee don't want you, I do, and I want you to occupy the office right here next to me and help me run this office. Under the law at that time, and it's still the law, no member of the legislature could receive any compensation or appointment from the governor during the term for which he was elected. My term ended 15 days after the election in November of 1940. So for about 5 or 6 months, I did work in and out of the governor's office without portfolio, without pay, and with hardly a place to sit down. But long in October, the governor told me, Governor Phillips, to find myself a room next to his in one of his rooms, get myself a secretary and a desk and a phone, and begin to lay out legislation. Well, I asked him, where do I get all of these things? And he said, that's up to you. I'm putting you to work. You go find how to get on the payroll and how to get help and get office space. So whenever you reach a position where you can quote to other state officers and employees that the governor told me so and so to do this is really the power of the governor's office. So what I did, I went over to the tax commission and I said, the governor told me to get a desk and a secretary from you and put them in an office next to him where I am to work. And with the right and the authority to quote the governor that, this happened just that way. They sent a desk over, they sent a secretary over who was on the staff of the tax commission, and I had a phone put in and I began to operate, although without any pay myself, on the state payroll. And I occupied an office, at that time one of the large big rooms next to the governor's office, and there were 3 other desks in there, and began to write a program for his next session, which began in January. This was how I started with Governor Phillips. After my term expired, why, I was then put on the state payroll and drew a salary as his legal advisor. But this is the way things were done. I stayed there until October of 1942 when I decided to leave. It was during this period that I read every bill that Governor Phillips signed in the 1941 session and wrote a 1-page recommendation to him as to what the bill contained, what it did to make new law, what it changed in the old law, and my idea whether he should sign it, veto it, or let it become law without his signature, or whatever else I wanted to add. It was our custom every morning during the legislative session to meet in his office about 5:30 to 6 in the morning and go over things that had to be done that day. And usually by 8 o'clock he had a program laid out and would have legislative leaders in, discuss the program for the day, and this is how we operated. Governor Phillips was a man of strong character. He had strong thoughts, strong ideas. He was very definite in what these were. And if you agreed with him, you got along with him. If you disagreed, you had to fight your way to do it. But after he accepted your disagreement, then he would grab your acceptance or your disagreement and go with it just as fast as he would his own. And all it took in dealing with a man like Governor Phillips was to say what you thought and stand your ground, and you would be heard and would achieve what you set out to do. The very moment that a person quailed or became discouraged or caved in, as we used to say, he had less regard than he did before because he expected you to stand up and stand your ground. And this is where I learned a lot of things along that line. I remember one time there was a Navy officer coming to Oklahoma to insist that Oklahoma exempt all the war contractors from sales tax. And Governor Phillips told me that he wasn't going to permit this, that a sales tax ought to apply to a war contractor just like anybody else, that he was making a profit and he ought to pay his taxes. The Congress of the United States, in passing the War Powers Act, had really authorized the war contractors to pay all state taxes levied against them, so that this was not an issue involving state and federal government. On this particular morning, the governor had told me the night before that this lawyer would be here from the Navy Department, an officer, and wanted to talk around 8:30 about it, and to have the Attorney General and some of the legislators and some people from Tulsa involved the Douglas Aircraft Company contract. So we arranged for this meeting, but I said to him, are you sure that you know what you want to do? And he said, yes, I'm going to tell him we aren't going to do it because no other state has done what he's done, and he hasn't assumed the same attitude with other states around Oklahoma. And I said, well, how do you know? Do you know for a fact that Colorado and New Mexico and Kansas and Arkansas have not done what he says that you must do? And Governor Phillips says, no, I read it in the newspaper. Oh, I said, well, I think it's a very risky thing to get into a real tough battle here and not know exactly where you stand, what these other states are doing. This was at 5:30 in the morning when we were holding this discussion. So he said, all right, you call all the other governors and we'll find that out. So at 5:30 we called the governor of Colorado and the governor of New Mexico and the governor of Kansas and the governor of Arkansas, and got first-hand information that they had not done what this Navy lawyer said that he was going to make Oklahoma do. And also some of them quoted the federal law to us that directed that that government contractors pay their sales taxes. So this is how Phillips operated. If you said, well, stop and think a minute and do something else, he'd do it. And we had the meeting that morning, and it was one of those stormy meetings where the Navy officer asserted the power of the federal government back of him, and said if that's the way the governor of Oklahoma felt, wouldn't cooperate to get war contractors in Oklahoma by letting them not pay sales taxes, that they would just close up their contracts in Oklahoma. And this was the worst thing he could have said to a man like Governor Phillips, because Governor Phillips looked right straight at him and said, I'll tell you what we will do. We are sending our best boys over to Berlin to get Mr. Hitler. And if this is your attitude, how you're going to run the United States government, we will stop and take you out on the way, because you're a dictator as harmful as Hitler is, and we will just get rid of you as we go to get Mr. Hitler. And this ended the morning session. It was a pretty hot morning, and I mean hot in the session, and there were a lot of people that were afraid the situation would turn out bad, but this was the way the Governor Phillips had to act. He had to tell these federal bureaucrats where they stood, and whether they liked it or not, that's the treatment they got. And this is what made Phillips a strong character. He didn't mind standing up when he had to stand up. During this period of time, I read all the bills that he signed except one. This was a long bill, the Small Loan Act. I had told him that I was against this bill. He was for it. And as a result, he told me, we were kidding one morning, he said, well, if you're against it, I'm for it, and I'll pass it in spite of you, I'll pass it. So I was working for him, you see, at the time as his legal advisor, and I was telling him I was opposing his main piece of legislation that he's wanted at that time. And we came into very serious disagreement, but this never did disturb our working together and in my relationship. He just pointed his finger and says, in spite of you, I'm going to pass it. Well, he did pass it by one vote. And that's the way it worked out. But when the bill came down from the legislature for him to sign, I was so upset about the bill, I was really mad about it being passed. I didn't like it. I just wrote a note on there and typed it and said, Governor Phillips, this is your loan shark bill, and signed my name and took it in to him. And he said, well, let me have it. I'll sign it right now so you won't have to bother with it anymore. So he signed it. It became law. Every other bill we would discuss generally and go over them. Had a stack of bills every morning. He would ask questions. Some of them he'd veto, some sign. But on some things like this, these were high points. We got along. We would laugh about these things and get along pretty well. But I made it a point, if I had an idea, why I would expose it to him and tell him what I thought. And it didn't make much difference to me whether he liked it or not, because my object was not to try to please him, but give him legal advice and sound political advice, which I thought I was doing. And I think he appreciated it, because in his last few days, months of his life, he frequently would call me, and I would go down to visit him at Willeka, his farm. In fact, when he died, in his will, he left me a set of books on Andrew Jackson and a fine shotgun that had been given to him. And in his will, he authorized me to have access to all his files and records where they were being stored in order to write a biography if I cared to do so. So I got along pretty well with Governor Phillips, both while he was governor and for many years afterwards. Governor Phillips had, in 1933, conceived the idea that the state higher educational system had to be coordinated better. Before his time, college presidents changed with every governor, because the governor would become patronage-minded, fire the presidents or have them fired, put in his own friends, and so forth. This was a common situation for presidents to change when the governor changed. In 1933, Red Phillips wrote a bill and introduced it in the legislature, creating a commission to study higher education with the idea of coordinating courses of study, its financial needs, and its functions. This bill became law. Governor Murray appointed a 50-man committee, I believe, a pretty large committee of citizens. They never did anything constructive. They probably met and made a report, but none of them really did. All the time that Phillips was in the legislature, he was talking this subject. And when he became governor, he called me in one day and said, I want to go back and see if we can't write a constitutional amendment on coordinating higher education. And he said, see what you can do to write it. So I began drafting an amendment to the Constitution to do this. After I'd made a number of drafts, he and I would discuss them, rewrite them, study other states, different things. I drafted the constitutional amendment creating the state regions for higher education, giving them the power to determine functions, allocate appropriations, and grant degrees, standardizing, coordinating all Oklahoma institutions of higher education that were supported by taxes. It also gave the power of the state regions to let non-state educational institutions coordinate with the Oklahoma state system. And this gave us in Oklahoma the first state coordinated system of higher education in the United States. The state adopted that in 1941. When we were drafting this amendment, the governor would say, well, you get a hold of a certain person and see what they think about parts of this or get ideas. One of these men was John Rogers of Tulsa, who was a very active citizen, a lawyer, had been on the OU Regents, was schooled in higher education. And he and I spent a lot of time revising, refining, and studying this amendment which I had drafted. We also, the Governor Phillips asked us to go down and talk to Bishop Francis Kelly of the Roman Catholic Church on this coordinating the state-owned institutions with non-state-owned institutions. John Rogers and I did visit with the Roman Catholic bishop and got his ideas as to whether or not it would be something that would be workable. He wanted such a scheme so that they could standardize their educational institutions along with the standardization of the state-owned institutions. This was a good thing. After the amendment had been changed and revised, Red Phillips was pretty well satisfied, although he had not read the latest versions. And but the idea had started with him in 1933, and it took until 1941 that he could come into a position where he could bring this idea into fruition and put it into effect. And that's 1941, 39 years later, 29 years later here, Oklahoma has been 25 years ahead of most of the states in coordinating higher education by this system. Whether the system has been put to its full use or not is another question, but Oklahoma was one of the first states, if not the first, to have a coordinated system of higher education under one large board of regents, which leaves the actual operation of each institution under its own separate board, who operate the institution in its educational areas. But as to functions, appropriations, granting degrees, this is the sole authority of the state regents for higher education. This is one of the great steps forward and can be made of greater use as time goes on, if the members of the State Regents Board will really read the Constitution and find out what their powers are. One interesting sidelight in and find out what their powers are. One interesting sidelight in this situation is that the college presidents as a group were opposed to Leon C. Phillips' ideas along this line. They fought it actively, organized against it. Up to that time, every head of every institution had to come to the legislature every 2 years and make his plea for money. As a result, he became a political advocate. And this is what got most of them into trouble. They'd have to go when the next governor came in. After this amendment was adopted, the presidents of the colleges never had to go to the legislature and become advocating politicians to get their appropriations. And the tenure of college presidents became so well established that the longest tenure of any college president in Oklahoma was Jacob Johnson, who served 39 years as the head of the college at Warner, Oklahoma. He could not have done this if it had not been for the State Regents for Higher Education system. Neither could George Cross have stayed at OU as long as he did, because
as president, he did not have to deal with the lawmaking powers in getting appropriations, which would have caused him trouble and gotten him into trouble that he could not have stayed on as president. The college presidents opposed this amendment. They had meetings about it. I remember when the amendment was being drawn, Governor Phillips called all the college presidents to a meeting in the Blue Room to discuss what they thought was their appropriation. After the meeting was open, all the college presidents were there with some of their regents. Governor Phillips came in and discussed their appropriations, and he said, "Now I have another matter I want to take up," and he turned to me. I was right behind him and said, "Bring in that amendment on the higher education." I went out and got it, the one that I had last drawn, and brought it back, and as I handed it to him, I whispered in his ear, "You haven't read this yourself yet. You don't know exactly what it says." So he picked it up and said to the college presidents, "I will read this to you," and he read it aloud to them. And then he said, "To be sure you understand it, I will read it aloud again to you so you'll all know what it is." And he read it the second time very slowly and loudly. And the college presidents were somewhat taken aback by it. They knew that this was going on, but they didn't know what the details would be. And this was the first time they had had an opportunity to hear them. So some of the smaller colleges, their presidents sat very quietly. Finally, Dr. Bazell got up and said, "I believe we could live with it." Dr. Bennett got up and said, "We must support the governor. We will try to live with this." And as a result, when they went out of there, on the record, they had endorsed it in a very lukewarm manner. Actually, some of them went out as against it and did oppose it later. But when the meeting was over, I said to Governor Phillips, "Don't ever do this to me again, to ask me to bring in something that you're going to explain and you don't even know what it is." He said, "Well, the reason I read it twice is because I wanted to be sure I understood what was in it." So that's why he had read it twice. Many years after, every time Red and I would get into some hot argument, he'd always recall this occasion to me and laugh about it, how he had put me on the spot by reading and picking up this amendment and endorsing it wholeheartedly without even knowing exactly what was in it. But this, again, illustrates the relationship between us, because I understood his thinking and he understood me pretty well, so that this was a way we could operate. Actually, the amendment that he read that day was the amendment that was submitted to the people and became part of the Constitution.
We're continuing with the interview with Mr. Herbert L. Brannon. Mr. Brannon, you designed the governor's mace for the state of Oklahoma. I wonder if you could describe that a little bit to us.
Yes, I'll describe it and also tell you how it happened to come about. Governor Bellman in 1966 conceived the idea that there should be some symbol of authority that should be handed from him as the outgoing governor to the newly elected governor at the end of his term. At that time, there was no idea that there would be a Republican follow him. It was in the early part of 1966. Bellman had been to Norfolk, Virginia, where he had seen a mace which was given to the city of Norfolk by the Queen of England in the late 1700s. And somewhere they had given him a small replica of this mace, which was about 4 inches long. He called me one day and asked me to come out to his office. This was in April, I believe, March or April of 1966. I went out to his office and he said, "I want you to design a mace for me to give to the next governor," or whatever you want to call it. Maybe the mace isn't the name for it, but anyway, he gave me this mace he had received in Virginia, this little replica. So I went back down to my office and began to make a little study of maces, and found out that the mace had first been a war tool of to fight with. Later, the mace in the British House of Commons is a very important instrument of authority, and then the most famous mace in the United States is that in the House of Representatives of the National Congress, where the mace is in position when the speaker is presiding and is removed when the speaker is out of the chair, and it's a symbol of authority. And the mace in the House of Representatives is used by the Sergeant at Arms to keep order. And under the rule of the House of Representatives, any person who is unruly, or wherever they have problems of unruly members, if the Speaker orders the Sergeant at Arms to present the mace to a member before him, and the member afterwards continues his unruliness, the rule is that he is summarily expelled, and this has actually happened on several occasions. Very few of them. But I made some drawings of a mace and got up some ideas and went back to see Governor Bellman and told him the problems of cost to make a silver mace would run way up into a huge number of dollars and have to take a long time to be made, and that I would work on one to be made out of wood, copper, gold, plate, or something of that nature. And so this was agreed on. I began to figure out designs to put on the mace, and went at my own home. I took the pasteboards out of shirts, pasteboard that comes from the laundry, and would bend these, fold them round or square in whatever form, and put them together and put drawings over the sides of them to see what the thing would look like and how I could make a design. The first thing I did was to make a square form out of pasteboard and put on each side the names of all the governors, beginning with the territorial governors. Then put on the side the name of the office of governor and the constitutional authority. I took this out to Governor Bellman, and he said, this is getting towards the idea, but I think putting governors' names on there isn't the thing to do, because if this lasts for 50 years or 100 years, you won't have space for them, and people forget who they are, and it becomes a matter of somebody else putting their name on big and another one on small and all this sort of thing. So I abandoned that thought and went back and went back to the Constitution of the state of Oklahoma and read all the Constitution through. I mean, I knew where to find what I was looking for. Every constitutional designation of the power of the governor. Conservative of the peace, he's head of the militia, he's the chief executive officer, he has the veto power, and he is governor. And there may be some other titles, but these I documented and wrote them out, and then found symbols to symbolize these. For instance, he's the conservator of the peace, which would mean that he has a justice, balances justice. This was a symbol. The gavel is the chief executive officer. The pen is a symbol of his power to veto. A sword is his power as head of the militia of the state. And each of these symbols I made designs for, or rough designs, and stuck them on to cardboard, made a square form, and put the title of the constitutional title of this function, and under it would put the symbol. And then on each side there is another symbol. The mistletoe is a state flower by law, and this is engraved on there. The redbud tree is a state tree by law, and this is engraved on the side of the mace. There are 4 sides to it. One side has the seal of the territory of Oklahoma, the seal of each of the 5 civilized tribes follows that territorial seal in alphabetical order: Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Seminole. These 5 tribes sealed, plus the territorial seals, covers the whole geographical territory of Oklahoma. and maybe not the Panhandle, but the Panhandle was made a part of Oklahoma Territory in 1890, so it does cover the entire geographical area. On above these and on a round ball at the top of the mace is a round ball of steel plated with copper and gold, is the state seal of Oklahoma. And on another side is the seal of the state of Oklahoma is the motto, Omnia Labor Vincit Labor, or whatever, the labor conquers all is the English for the Latin phrase. And on the other side, I coined a phrase which Governor Bellman was very happy to approve, and that above all, law and order and God. This is not the exact wording. I'll have to put that in here, but that's a phrase that we put on there because we thought this was necessary. So this mace itself is weighs about 40 pounds, is over 28 inches high, is topped with a steel ball. One side is the motto and the phrase that we put on there. The other side is the seal of the state, and then the sides of the mace. One side contains all these seals of the 5 tribes and the territory. Another side contains the scales of justice, in balance. Another side, the gavel and the sword. And these are the symbols of, and the pen, the governor's pen, is the veto power. And on each of these sides is the constitutional designation of his title, and exemplified by the symbols on the sides. At the bottom of this is a handle that's about 12 inches long, so it can be carried. And also this handle is made to be put into a round post, which was designed by myself to set it in the blue room where it could be on display. The handle sits down into the big round post. So that's the governor's mace. It was Governor Bellman's idea to do this. He paid for it himself or by state funds. I never knew how. After he approved the complete drawings, I went down and had an engraving company make complete drawings, and we went out. Governor approved these in the latter part of November of '66, and they were rushed to make it up and have it ready for the inaugural of Governor Bartlett in January of 1967. So this was the first time the mace was actually used in the inaugural of a governor. Governor Bartlett is very proud of it, and he's kept it in the blue room. Later I had, through the help of Penn Woods, a photograph made by a photographer, and 9 sets of these photographs showing a picture of the governor's mace. And one of them hangs in the governor's office, one of them hangs in the blue room, one of them was given to Bellman, and one of them was given to each of the former governors living, a picture, and I have a picture signed by all the living governors with a copy of the mace. They signed, autographed these pictures because each of the governors is also proud of the governor's mace. That's about the story on that. The question will arise is if Bartlett is re-elected, he'd be the first governor to follow himself as governor. How can he hand himself the mace in January of 1971?
Could you comment a little on the budget balancing?
I don't know, it's too short. The budget balancing amendment was an idea that originated in my mind in 1935 and was adopted in 1941. In 1935, the state was in dire financial straits. The legislature would usually appropriate money and go home, and the state would be in debt, ran up as high as $10 million one session. That session of 35, I put in a resolution that before any appropriation be made, that a complete survey be made of all the revenue, and that no appropriation bill be passed until this survey was in, where we could decide whether or not there would be sufficient money to pay the bills to be passed. this motion was defeated, went to a committee and died because nobody had any thought of stopping the state from going into debt. They had no way to do it. And this is where the idea was born with me that this had to come about to put Oklahoma on a sound financial basis. This was went on a thing that a lot of us talked about for several years during several sessions. But in 1940, when I came to Governor Phillips' office as his liaison man, another thing he says, you ought to get out this budget balancing idea and try to put that in writing in an amendment to the Constitution. So I did. I went to the Attorney General. He began to give me advice, and the governor appointed a group of lawyers to meet and discuss legal angles. I read every constitution of all the 48 states. None of them had anything like it. Alabama had something that bordered on it, but it wasn't the real thing. As a result of that, we drew the budget balancing amendment. I drew it myself, and it was changed in one or two ways on the floor of the House of Representatives. But it was Governor Phillips' idea to fight it through, and it was fought through. The legislature adopted state regions for higher education, old age pension change, and the budget balancing amendment, and submitted them to a vote of the people in March 1941. The legislature then adjourned for 2 weeks while this election was being held, and they were adopted. And that's the way the budget balancing amendment came into being. Actually, what it does, it authorizes it prohibits the legislature from appropriating more money than is actually going to be coming in based on the previous year's revenue. At that time, it was a 3-year average to be used to determine the limit that they could appropriate. After Governor Bartlett was elected governor and the legislature began to meet in annual sessions, Governor Bartlett called me out to his office one day and said, we've got to change the budget balancing amendment so that it will harmonize with the annual sessions. And he asked me to think about it. I went and studied it, worked out a number of hypothetical situations to see if it would, what had to be done, and came to the conclusion that it ought to be done on an annual basis rather than on a biennial basis. So then Governor Bartlett advocated, and there was submitted to the people an amendment to the budget balancing amendment to provide the limit appropriations was based on the previous year's revenue rather than the average of the previous 3 years' revenue. This was adopted, and that's the way the legislature operates today. But the effect of this amendment was to put Oklahoma on a cash basis in its general revenue fund operation. It cannot go into debt without a vote of the people and a levy of taxes to pay for it. This puts it in the power of the people to determine whether there will be a state debt or not. It takes it out of the hand of the legislature or the courts or the governor. As a result of this, Oklahoma has a balanced budget every year in its general revenue operation and will continue to do so as long as they keep this amendment and make it work. It has been one of the most popular things that was advocated by Governor Leon C. Phillips, and he deserves the credit because he was willing to fight it through over the opposition of many groups who were claimants for state appropriations like schools, colleges, and such as that. To me, this has kept the credit of Oklahoma good, and it helps business because if the credit of the state is good, then the credit of business is in good shape. Stabilizes state government, and that's what business must have in order to operate. I could tell a lot about the budget balance amendment and probably should go into detail on a whole lot of things that happened at the time, but this is the general background.